Thank you, everyone, for coming here tonight to hear Fred Van Liew talk about restorative justice. I'm Kathy Gorley, and I'm here with Friends of Restorative Justice, one of the two sponsors of this evening. The other one is the Dispute Resolution Center. So Friends of Restorative Justice started about 12 years ago. It was a collaborative of people from different faith communities around Washtenaw County who were working in prisons and jails and criminal justice reform. We were meeting every month or every other month. One of the churches that came to the meetings was Shalom Community Church, and they started telling the rest of us about restorative justice. And once we learned what it was, we thought, gee, this is great. This is a much better way of handling crime than the way our system does it now. And we started putting an emphasis on restorative justice, teaching other people about restorative justice, trying to promote it. And we've been doing that ever since, along with other criminal justice reform. But restorative justice is a prime solution that we would like to see become commonplace. This evening is part of our efforts to educate people about restorative justice so that they can ask for it or recommend it should the need arise. We also are working for it to become an accepted part of the criminal legal system. It is in Washtenaw County, but we want it to be so in Michigan, that anybody who is victimized by a crime can ask for restorative justice if they want it. We think it takes some legislation to make this happen, so we'd like to see that happen. Friends of Restorative Justice meets monthly, either on Zoom or in person. In the summer, we're trying to meet more in person, but in the winter, we'll go back to Zoom. If you're interested in learning more about it, or perhaps joining us, there's an attendance sheet here that my husband's going to pass around, and if you haven't signed it, you can sign it. There's a little column, just check if you want to learn more about Friends of Restorative Justice. I'm there. He's my teacher's assistant. He's also going to pass out, in case you didn't see in the back, there's a table with some books that you can look at, and a reading list. So there's the attendance sheet, followed by the reading list. And if you want to do any homework, there's all sorts of books you can read, articles you can read, and videos on the reading list. As I said, the other sponsor of Fred Van Liew's event this evening is the Washtenaw Dispute Resolution Center. Some of Friends of Restorative Justice members have been trained by this organization, and we actually do restorative justice with the Dispute Resolution Center. Next I'd like to introduce Belinda Doolin, who is the Executive Director of the Dispute Resolution Center, to tell us a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Kathy. Thanks everybody for being here. I want to give a special shout out from our friends, DRC friends who traveled from Detroit to hear more about restorative justice. So thank you for being here, because I know traffic is bad on 94. I'm Belinda Doolin, the Executive Director of the Dispute Resolution Center. And as Kathy said, we are partnering and co-sponsoring tonight's event. Fred has been truly a blessing to us as we were thinking through the ideology and the process and how to make this happen and make it real. I think I met you or heard you speak 8 years ago. You came to Ann Arbor around 8 years ago. Then I read one of your books and have sort of been following you. And I think this is your third time being here in Ann Arbor, coming as an advisor, a very trusted advisor in this work. I'll leave his introduction to Joe. The DRC has been around for a very long time, for decades. We're looking at our 40th year of being incorporated as a community dispute resolution program. And as many of you know, we've been doing mediation all this time. And probably about 14 years ago, we decided to take a closer look at restorative practices. We worked with one of our school districts for a while, helping kids do address peer-to-peer conflict and peer-to-staff conflict. Then we started working with another school district, and we began to train students to be circle keepers. That program is still going. I think it's in its 9th year. And we've trained students across Washtenaw County from almost every school district in the county. We've trained high school students over the years. Very recently, though, with the last federal election, Liew Savage became our county prosecutor. And for those of you who are embedded in Washtenaw County in the nonprofit industry, you know that our previous prosecutor was not too keen on restorative justice. And that's okay. I mean, sometimes it's timing, sometimes like location, sometimes it's just timing. But when the election resulted with Liew Savage being our county prosecutor, he hit the ground running, putting together policy around restorative justice. He wanted to use this method to address low-level harms in the community, give people an opportunity and a pathway to repair the harm and restore relationships if they wanted to, but definitely to repair the harm. And that means, what that means in real life is that community members don't have to sit in jail needlessly. They can be deflected or diverted from the criminal legal system. And for those of us who follow the data for Washtenaw County, we know that in our county jail, we have lots of poor people and people with mental illness that sit in our jail. Most of the people who sit in our jail will fall in one of those two categories, if not both. So restorative justice is a pathway that allows folks who have been harmed, if they choose, is very survivor-centered. If the survivor chooses to sit in circle with the person who's harmed them, and the person who did the harm really wants to be responsible and be accountable for what has happened, they are invited to the circle by the DRC staff. I'm just going to ask you to raise your hand, DRC staff, so folks can know where you are, if they have any specific questions. But they get a chance to sit in circle and have a dialogue that the criminal legal system would not allow them to have. And they get to talk about what happened, the impact of it, and what needs to be done to repair it. And I'm very happy that we stayed with it at the DRC. We're a tiny little nonprofit. It's not an easy mountain to climb, but I'm so happy that we are. And I'm very, very happy with the partnership that we've developed with Forge, and that Fred is a trusted advisor and friend of ours. He doesn't mind sharing his insight and his wisdom and keeping us going. So tonight is going to be extra special because now we have community members from the nonprofit sector. This is your opportunity to ask your questions, to gain more insight. And I always invite people to challenge it. If this is so new and so different from what we're used to in our society. So if you want to challenge any of the concepts and theories, I'm used to it. I've been doing it for 14 years now. I take the good and the bad, but this is a time for us to start the community dialogue so that we can be on this journey together. The circle is a big step. We're very proud of it, but we cannot do it without the support of the community. So thank you for being here, and I'll pass this over to Joe.
Sorry, I'm going to jump in here because I forgot two technical things. One is there's not going to be a break. We have the room until 8, and Fred's going to talk until whenever, but there'll be time for questions. And we may get done earlier, and then, but if you want refreshments, feel free to get up and get them anytime, or if you need to go to the restroom, it's out the door to the left.
Hi. My name is Joe Summers, and for 35 years I was the pastor of a small congregation that worked with people in prison, coming out of prison, and on criminal justice reform. And really, when restorative justice, not two little stories. One story was we were very successful in creating a prisoner reentry program for our county that, like the state program, cut recidivism almost in half, cut the prison population in Michigan by 20% over 4 or 5 years, and the reward was to cut our budget by 60%. And once we saw that, didn't have any control on the local level, this was all state politics, I felt like, okay, we've got to focus on the county, because we can have more say-so in how money gets spent on the county level. And this is where Fred comes in, because Fred came to town. The UU seemed pretty packed of the social hall, and that night 50 people signed up wanting to work on restorative justice. And Friends of Restorative Justice has been active and going ever since then. I could say many things about Fred, but I think he's better at telling his own story than I am, so I don't want to cut into his time, but I do want to say something about why he's so important to me. And this has to do with moral courage. I think it takes moral courage to speak up when something that many people are invested in or even have dedicated their lives to simply is not working, as was and is the case with our criminal legal system. It takes a particular kind of moral courage to acknowledge that when you hold a prominent place in that system, as Fred did, as it would be so much easier to go along to get along. It takes even more moral courage to risk trying new things when you have a lot of people irked by your critique and therefore often hoping you may fail, as that would prove that what we've always been doing is simply the best we can. And the very word risking new things means that it is almost an assurance that some things will fail, because any new thing you do takes a while to get it right. Don't be talking about doing things differently if you're not willing to deal with some failures and face the criticism that comes with it. And I just have to say, I think our county, we've specialized in covering our political leaders' asses while making sure the dispute resolution takes all the risks, for example. The first night Fred spoke to us, he said it was going to take something like 40 to 50 years to transform our punitive justice system into a restorative justice system. That sounded like a long time at that point. Now I think he's, that's maybe optimistic, but we'll see. To shift the focus of our criminal legal system from punishment to how to help people heal from crime and to stop committing crimes. We're now 10 or 20 years into the struggle, and we've made some progress, but the going is still very rough in part because so many of our political and criminal system leaders lack the moral courage to face what is not working and to let us begin to try some really new things. And by the way, here I want to say, I'm no longer so interested in restorative justice for minor crimes, for things that maybe shouldn't even be considered crimes. I mean, it's just things, when I was in high school, we did all sorts of things that nowadays would get you a felony charge. Not thrilled about that, but it just means we don't want to expand the net of the criminal justice system. We want to reduce the net. And this is particularly related, so, you may think restorative justice sounds great, but think about what if it involves a violent crime? What if it involves somebody who's really been hurt? What if it involves the way real crime breaks the fabric of community? That's when we get to the brass tacks. And that's where I think restorative justice also holds out such promise. So I still don't see our county leaders being bold. I'm grateful that they've moved a bit. Grateful they're at least committed to restorative justice in theory, but I want to see the practice. And they're not taking the same kind of risk that they would have taken 10 or 20 years ago, because over the last 10 or 20 years, all these countries in Europe have moved ahead, done many of these experiments, shown that these things can work. So I think the real issue for all of us is that we still have internalized this idea of a meritocracy that mandates that we punish bad people or people for doing bad things. And this is in all of our guts. If you don't know it's there, just wait till somebody hurts you with it and it'll start talking in your ear. And though we know this meritocracy justifies our racial and economic hierarchies and traps people in poverty and the living death of incarceration, it's something we're all needing to struggle with if we're going to create a society in which all have a chance to thrive. So I hope you'll have the courage to open your hearts and ears to a vision of how our community and this county could be doing things in ways that are so much more life-giving for all. So let's welcome Fred.
It's so good. It's really so good to be back here. So I grew up Catholic, so I can say I have a confession to make. I spent most of April in Egypt and travel in the Nile, and it was absolutely fascinating. I wanted to spend time in a Muslim country, and I was.
Fred, hold the mic up just a little closer.
I was humbled, beyond humbled by the kindness of the people that I met in Egypt every single day, over and over and over again. It's hard traveling. I spent 6 months a year before traveling around the world with my backpack, but had not gotten to Egypt. And so I wanted to go to Egypt specifically, and also to go to a Muslim country for a while. And but as I said, I was humbled by the kindness, but it's also a difficult country to travel in somewhat. But anyway, I flew to Dublin and was going to spend the night before flying to Boston. I had some work to do in Maine on the way home. And I got an email from Kathy. And and I was tired.
I knew you were tired.
And I said, wait a minute. I said, we need to talk about this. And we'd gone from me coming today, tomorrow, the next day, and having some small meetings to what appeared like 6 two-hour presentations in which audio-visual materials would be needed. So I sent a little note to Kathy, and right away she calls, okay. And she says, oh, those were just notes. You know, no, I don't mean that you're going to be talking to audiences. I don't know what you folks are. But we worked through it, and then she came up, or not just Kathy, but the whole team came up, I think with a very, for my purposes, a very meaningful 3 days here. And I immediately have gone back to the 2 other times I've come and how I've been received, and it's very, very, very humbling. So now that I've got that confession out of the way. So and now I have to make amends, right? So, so on the so on the flight, everybody said, well, how'd your flight go? I just flew from Des Moines. The nice thing about Detroit is one of the few cities in the country that you can fly to nonstop from Des Moines. And had a very nice nonstop flight. Kathy picked me up, took me to a very nice place. But I was trying to think, you know, and I think people are at different places here. I mean, there are people that do circle work, that are doing mediation work, dialogue work in prisons, et cetera, and other people that are here maybe have heard about it but haven't actually been involved in an RHA process or something. So some of this may be old hat, so to speak, and some of it may be new. But I'll probably flit around a little bit. I used to be a lawyer. I'm in recovery now. Takes a while. If there are any recovering lawyers here, you know, it takes a while to get out of their blood. My wife insists that I'm still a lawyer. But I was trying to think, how do we define restorative justice, you know? And I used to read those books. I don't read restorative justice books anymore, actually. So I can't recall the definition. And then I realized, you know what? It's like the elephant, right? You know, and the 4 or 5 blind men. Okay. It is not one thing, and it's certainly not a program. It is not a program. in my own mind, over the last, I got bit by the restorative justice bug in 1991, so it's been a long time, 33 years. And I realized that it is a way of living. You know, it is not just something, not to minimize at all, to say that it's not the preferred way of responding to wrongdoing or harm, all right? But it's a way of living, of being in a relationship with people, you know. And so how does that play out in the work we do? Well, it just depends on the work that we do, okay? It's just not one thing. So, for example, I do a lot of work in the state of Maine, have been going there for about 12 years. And there, Maine is primarily, Maine had restorative justice in the 90s, at a time when there was money for it, okay? Money dried up, centers folded, and it got resurrected. Not really resurrected, it got revisited. Restorative justice sort of, in a sense, revisited Maine in the early, maybe 2005, 2006, a retired seminary, a professor from New York City, moved upstate Maine and got bored and started, gathered some people around this notion of restorative justice. In Maine, to this day, for the most part, and later on I'll talk about the work that I do with the criminal, in the criminal juvenile justice in Maine, but for the most part, in Maine, it is, it's for low-level juvenile offenses, okay. And so that's part of it. That's like, you know, right, the blind man and the elephant, and he's touching the leg, and he says, oh yeah, restorative justice is juveniles who've committed, you know, minor offenses, you know. And then sometimes in prisons, what do they know about restorative justice? They could be victim impact panels. That's what they know. You can go to Texas, where they kill people right and left, and they're doing restorative dialogues in prisons with people on death row, right? So there is no, I don't believe anyway, there's a single definition for restorative justice. There's certainly not a single restorative process, okay? There's not a single restorative process. I remember, and how many of you, yeah, many of you probably know of Howard Zehr, right? Z-E-H-R, you know, I call him grandfather, godfather of restorative justice. Howard probably, he didn't start it. In fact, he admitted to me a couple of years, he didn't even invent the word restorative justice. He found it in some arcane German academic journal. Thought it sounded good, and so he started using the term restorative justice. But I'll tell one, well, I'll tell more than one story, because if restorative justice is anything, it is storytelling. It is storytelling, okay? That's where its power comes from, is people being allowed to tell their story uninterrupted, not cross-examined, not bound by any rules or anything. It is storytelling, okay? And I was thinking, do you know that, I think it's a Zen story. It's like the 10 or 12 ox. Do you know about that? And it sort of takes you through the life of a man until he's an old man. And he realizes the last story, the 12th story, and he's with the ox, and what he sort of realizes is, oh, well, life is what I thought it was at the beginning before I went through everything, you know, and now here I am at the end, and it's just the same as it was back then, but I didn't appreciate it back then. That's sort of me with restorative justice. I fell in love with restorative justice because of this incredible power of being in a room where it's safe, and somebody who got hurt really bad is able to tell his or her story to the person who hurt them right across the table. That was my first, aside from reading Howard's book, Changing Lenses. How many's read Changing Lenses? It's an essential read, by the way, and when I come back in 2 years, I'll poll you. You have to read Changing Lenses, partly because it was such a seminal work back in the late 80s, and it's still, the first really good read on the power of restorative justice, I think. Okay. So, and I don't know if it's in restorative justice, or I don't know if it's in Changing Lens or whatever, but And Howard and I read it in 91. And then I've been acquaintances with friends for the last 30-some years, ever since then. But I either asked him, or maybe it was in Changing Lenses, I don't remember. I said, how do you define it? And he said, I have no definition for restorative justice, really. It's like a flame, okay? Just a flame, fire, flame. It's something, it's an aspiration. We aspire to be restorative, okay? And I think that's as good as anything. And I'd much rather that if you're going to err on the side of one definition over another, you err on the side that it's something to aspire to rather than it's a program. Okay? I think to call it, I'm not saying anybody here calls it a program at all, but to call it a program really diminishes its power, its impact, its the way that it changes lives, quite frankly. Okay? So, so for me, my little story, I never thought I'd be a prosecutor, but I ended up a prosecutor in the mid-'80s. And I was always sort of a social worker prosecutor. And it really bothered me that government lawyers didn't think they had to do pro bono work. So I went to the Iowa Attorney General. I said, I want to start an organization for government attorneys doing pro bono. And, oh, okay, Fred, what are you going to call it? I said, well, I'm going to call it GARP. You remember GARP and Robin Williams? Government Attorneys Resisting Poverty. He didn't like that. I don't know why. So we called it GAP, Government Attorneys Pro Bono. But anyway, it was during the time of the farmer-creditor crisis in Iowa, and you probably went through it as well in the 80s, right? The farm crisis. And so the first thing we were asked to do was to facilitate farmer-creditor mediations, okay? So we went through a training. And it was at Drake University in 1985, and it was part of it was a 3-day standard mediation training. I don't know, Belinda, how many hours how much?
40 hours.
40 hours. It was a 40 hours, a standard 40 hour. But I will never forget. The only thing I remember, in fact, from the 40 hours was one hour session. And there were breakouts. There's our breakouts, right? So you can go to 3 or 4 different things. You can go to room B, and they're going to show a film. The use of mediation in criminal cases, okay? And so I went in, there's like 2 other people, there's an old projector, I don't remember what those look like, and there was a black and white film that was just starting. And it was a young mom sitting across the table from a 16, 17-year-old boy, and it turns out there had been a burglary, a residential burglary, okay? And the mom's a single mom, 3 kids, and they'd been out for a movie, came back, and the house was torn up. Okay, graffiti, some cherished family possessions gone, other things broken. And here we are, fast forward 3 or 4 months, and she's meeting in and back then, way back then, they called it victim offender mediation. Okay, that lost its value. Maybe in the early 90s, I forget. But back then it was still called victim offender mediation, and here it was the victim of this very, very intrusive crime was talking to this young man. And I was a prosecutor at the time, and I was prosecuting burglary cases at the time. And first of all, I was just amazed that, oh, okay, they're in the room together. Okay, they're sitting across from each other. There's somebody at the end of the table who's not actually talking too much. And this woman is telling the story of, and I think the title of this is Healing Harm Through RJ. It's very appropriate that that's the title of this evening. Here it is, right? Playing out right in front of me on film is this healing taking place. And the healing, at least in the early going, really, I mean, it had something to do with the boy, but the boy hadn't said a thing yet. The healing started with the telling of the story. Okay, the telling of the story without being interrupted. Okay, for as long as she wanted to talk about how she and her children were harmed, financially, emotionally. She actually got, this is the very first time I ever thought about it. And I think about it all the time now with restorative justice. She said, do you know what you stole from us that night? It's the first time she asked him a question. Well, yeah, I know I took a bracelet. Yes, you did. But you know what you stole from us that night? You stole our sense of safety. You stole our sense of safety last night, and we haven't recovered that yet. My daughters can't sleep by themselves. You know, we got an alarm system, changed the locks. I'm even thinking about getting a gun. You know. So she's telling this story to the person who hurts. And then the story, you can see it's having an impact on him right there. He's getting teary. He sort of slumps down, you know. And then she recognizes that her story is having this power, you know. And subsequent to then, years later, I begin to think, oh, restorative justice provides agency, okay? You know, in the telling of your story to the person that hurt you, you're reclaiming your life, right? You know, and so now you have agency where before you were a victim, and I may get the words wrong, you know, but that's the way I see it, and I've seen it hundreds of times since then, is the reclaiming, you know, by the telling of the story, and not just the telling of the story, but the telling of the story to the person who hurt you, and seeing that your story is impacting them deeply, you know. So I was 85, 86. I didn't know what to do with that. What do I do with that? I'm a prosecutor. You know, we have a neighborhood mediation center, but we're not mediating anything, you know, where there's a crime like this, you know. And fast forward 5 years, I've been in criminal practice, teaching law school and stuff, and I get hired to be the first assistant for the Polk County, Iowa Attorney's Office, Des Moines, the capital. And that summer of '91, I was hired in January, starting in the summer, I get a letter from a minister. He said, Fred, you got to find out about this thing called restorative justice. Never heard of it. Didn't even make sense, right? Restorative justice together, you know. And somehow I got a hold of Howard's book, Changing Lenses. We had 25 mediators at the time. I ordered 30 copies. We had a trading. And we just started doing it. You know, no law required, as I've, you know, what's that old saying, you know, about apologizing, you know?
Don't
Ask
ask
forgiveness
permission,
and
ask for,
permission.
Yeah, right, there you go, right.
Yeah.
So my approach was, if the legislature doesn't say you can't do it, you can do it. If there's no legal prohibition, you just do it, okay? And I talked to my boss. I was the first assistant, so he trusted me up to a point. And and I said, I want to do this thing. What thing? This thing is called restorative justice. Oh, okay. Well, how do you plan on doing it? I said, I'll tell you what. We get unemployment fraud cases. How about I try it out on a bunch of unemployment fraud cases from the state? Okay, nothing bad can happen. So we did about 20 of them over about a 2-week period. Okay, we had a facilitator and somebody from the state. They were incredible. I mean, the stories that came out were just incredible. It wasn't about cheating the government. It was about people's lives, you know. And so I reported back to him. I said, you know, they worked really well. And what you tell the prosecutor, by the way, and Kathy and I were talking about this, you always tell the people in the system what they want to hear, okay? So we got restitution agreements in every single case, John. Okay, so that's what you tell them, right? It's not about the emotional stuff, because he wouldn't have gotten it. But he can understand restitution and the people that are in agreements and they're filed with the court, blah, blah, blah. And I said, I'd like to try it on some other cases. Well, like what? Well, how about shoplift? Okay. They better not end up in the newspaper, right? If it ends up in the newspaper, we're done. Okay, no. So we started doing shoplift cases. And how would I do it? Where these cases come from? And I know that sometimes communities can have trouble with the public defender's office. Our public defender's office was skeptical. You know, how can my client say what he did in front of the person that he did it to, you know, and along with somebody else, how can they, you know? I said, listen, you come, you sit, you watch, keep your mouth shut, and you'll see there's a real value in it. And so over a period of about a year, the public defender's office, they got in line. They saw, oh, I'm not afraid for my client. I don't need to come to these. I really like it that my client is having to hear about what he did to the person he did it to, and maybe he or she won't offend as often. So they got it from that standpoint, okay? You know, it's safe, it's confidential, it has an impact that standing up in front of a judge does not have, okay? And so when, as the first assistant, I screened cases. Not every case came in the office, but I screened many cases. So I had the ability to sort of take cases, call public defender, hey, I got this is your client, what do you think? You know, and many more times than not, they said, fine, okay. So that goes on for a year or two like that, the low level, you know, no court involvement whatsoever, okay, just doing them, okay. But if there was an agreement came out of it, we would submit it to the court at the time of sentencing. They would accept it, no problem. You know, makes sense. Oh, yeah, the two people met, and this is what they agreed to. Well, I'm okay with that. And then we started doing, you know, more serious cases, some burglaries, motor vehicle thefts, that kind of thing. And about 3 years in, maybe 94, 95, the chief associate district court, Iowa has associate district court, which is non-felonies, well, on the criminal side, basically non-felonies, okay. And the chief judge called me over and said, what's this thing you're doing? Okay, what's this thing, right? Well, I explained, it's very simple, you know, we have trained people, and we're in a confidential place, safe place, and we talk about what happened, what led up to it, what's been learned from it, you know, what's been put in place so it's not as likely to happen again. Oh, that makes sense. And she started putting it in her sentencing orders, okay? That if restitution is owed, the way she would put it was, if restitution is owed, then the offender shall meet with the victim, if the victim wants to meet, to talk about restitution and to talk about other impacts of the crime. And that's the operative phrase. And to talk about other impacts of the crime. Okay? And she just put it in there, two-sentence thing. And then about a year later, the chief district court judge called, Judge Gale for it. Yeah, hi, Judge. What's this thing you're doing? And he's in charge of all the felony stuff, okay? I said, well, I can't tell you on the phone. We can have a meeting and talk about it. Okay, you come to my office noon Thursday. So go over, and he looks at me. Well, this is social work. Right? I mean, this is a criminal justice system. This is not about social work. And so then I had stories to tell him. Obviously, I had 4 years worth of stories to tell him by then. And he said, oh, okay. Well, we'll start putting it in the sentencing order. So since the mid-90s, it's been in standard sentencing orders in Polk County. That if there's restitution and if the victim wants to meet, there will be discussion about restitution and other impacts of the crime on the victim. Okay. So that's pretty much through the 90s. That's how we operated. We created a Restorative Justice Center inside the county attorney's office, but created what we call Chinese wall, so to separate prosecutors. They don't have access to anything that happens over here. But my belief back then still is my belief that a victim has a right to meet the person who hurt them if the victim wants to meet them. I truly believe they have a right. Okay. And if the victim wants to meet them, if the victim is ready. And that also means if the person who caused the harm is also ready. Okay, so there's preparation that takes place. Is it easy? No, it's not easy. You know, I used to have defense attorneys have me meet their clients in jail to explain restorative justice to them. They'd say, oh, I can't really explain it for the way you do. Will you meet with my guy? And I said, sure. And we'd have meetings. And they would routinely tell me I'd rather stay in jail than meet the person that I hurt.
Sure.
You know, it's a lot easier just to sit here than to sit across the table. But they happen. And we were doing still do, vehicular homicides, murders, sexual assaults. I mean, it is not just for low-level offenses that many people here know, and Joe knows very well. In fact, fairly early on, I recognized that the greatest opportunity for transformation is in those cases where the greatest harm has occurred. Okay, because where the greatest harm has occurred is where the harm is ongoing. Okay, the person's stuck. Right, they can't move on from this thing that has happened. You know, and the court thing doesn't help. You know, and I would get calls from women. Do you remember me? I was in court 3 years ago. I was told I could meet him before he got sent to prison, you know, on sexual assault. I couldn't imagine meeting him. Now I need to meet him. I've been to counseling, I've been to therapy, but I need to sit across the table from him and look him in the eye and tell him how my life was changed that night. And it's changed forever. And I still hurt from it, even though I'm doing better. But I need to look across the table from him. And so it's clearly not just for low-level offenses. It can be any age, okay? I actually did one about a month ago with an 88-year-old man, okay, who used to be very well-to-do, lost everything, and he shoplifted a razor and shaving cream, okay? But deeply, deeply ashamed, okay, for what he did, okay. So through the 90s, in our office in Des Moines, Polk County, that's what we did. I had the opportunity in 2005. I've been doing it for 15 years for adult criminal cases. And I asked my boss, I said, I'd like to switch with Ray. Ray ran the Juvenile Bureau. I want to see, how can we impact a system with restorative justice? Because what I really struggled with for 15 years is, okay, this is an incredibly powerful thing. Okay, this is in fact the way we should do business, you know, if at all possible. But how does it change the system? Because I saw many, many meaningful dialogues, right, where truly healing had occurred, okay, and people could move on. And you know, you get letters or emails or calls, you know, I can move on now. I can get on with my life now. I mean, it's amazing. 1 2-hour meeting, I can get on with my life now. I've been stuck for 3 years. Now I can get on with my life because I told the person who hurt me what they did to me, you know. But that's it. That is it. That's the conversation. So before I moved on to the juvenile part, I do want to address the other part of the title of this and the role of the community. Okay. So what happens? What happens, particularly on the prosecutor side? Okay. So you need to find a prosecutor that that you can sort of what do I call it? I had an expression early on for what restorative justice had done to me. It's like it damaged me. Because I couldn't be a normal prosecutor anymore, you know. I could not be a normal prosecutor. You know, I would have stacks of cases, and I'd have to assign them to other prosecutors in the office. And the question always is, as you go through files, is how do we prove he did it? Okay. Well, that wasn't the question anymore. The question is, oh, now what do we do? We know he did it, or we're pretty sure we know he did it, and they'll figure out how we did it, but that's not my concern anymore. My concern now is, now what do we do? You know, it's easy to prove that they did it, generally. You know, we bring in some cops, we bring in people and put them on the stand, we get a conviction, and then business as usual. Send them to prison or jail or whatever. But the tougher question is, but the question that restorative justice always raises is, now what do we do? How do we respond? Because that's what restorative justice really, I mean, in restorative justice, again, I don't want to try to cast a definition, and restorative justice is many things, and it can be very proactive, but traditionally, and at its core, restorative justice is a response to harm, okay? So, how do we respond to harm, okay? So, if you read Changing Lenses, Howard's book, Howard says, you know, we've been looking at wrongdoing through the wrong lens for too long, right? That's the basic premise of his book. We've been looking at wrongdoing through the wrong lens. We've been looking at wrongdoing through a punitive lens, a punishment lens. Doesn't work. Everybody in this room knows that does not work, right? What are we doing about it? Well, not too much, some, and there's really good people that are advocates, and some good things have happened. But Howard said, and I bet there's not a week that goes by that I don't think about this. He said, we need to look at wrongdoing through a reparative lens, right? Through a reparative lens, not through a punishment lens, but through a reparative lens. And so what happens when we look at wrongdoing through a reparative lens? We get different questions. Different questions get asked. If we look at it through a punishment lens, it's, okay, who did it? How do we prove that they did it? What do we do to them once we prove that they did it? Okay? Is there ever a mention of victim there? No. Okay? But if we look at wrongdoing through a reparative lens, the question is, okay, was there a harm? Who was harmed? How were they harmed? Who caused the harm? How can the individual or individuals who caused the harm participate in the reparation, in the repair? Totally different questions, right? So when I picked up individual files, those were the questions. I couldn't even get them out of my head anymore, you know. Okay, who was harmed? Well, obviously she was harmed, yeah. How was she harmed? Well, you know, they broke in, you know, took these things. She reports to the police, you know, she's in therapy, you know. How might the person who did these things, not all of them knowingly, right? I mean, rarely do they know what they're putting in motion, right, when they cause the harm that they cause, you know. But how can they somehow participate in the repair? Okay. So this comes to, I actually have, I did this, my last jury trial. It was supposed to have been a restorative justice case. I was asked by the Attorney General's office to bring these two men. One was an Iranian professor at Iowa State University, and one was a Jewish professor at Iowa State University, neighbors, and they got into a fight. And the Jewish guy wanted his neighbor thrown in jail. The Attorney General's office said, no, you need to call that county attorney. This is not something where people should go to jail. This is restorative justice. And the county attorney was old school. No, he did it. Going to have a trial. We had a trial, 1 hour. He was acquitted. But there's the cars. The reason I brought that little story up is I had 5 kids at the time, and one of them was in trouble or something, so I didn't have time to do a closing argument. So I woke up at about 5 and just put my closing argument on a bunch of note cards. So that's what I did tonight, but now they're not in the right order. But the one I wanted to talk about now was accountability. Okay. What do we mean when we talk about accountability for someone who commits a crime? What does it mean? What is that accountability? Well, there's sort of the obvious things. Restitution. Restitution's one. Community service. You know, those kinds of things are really not restorative justice. What I've come to see is that in the context of restorative justice and more specifically restorative dialogue. I'm not talking about circle right now as much as I'm talking about restorative dialogue, 2 people facilitator. Accountability is the listening. That's like the threshold step of accountability for the person who caused the harm. Just to listen to the story. Not to apologize, not to try to offer some explanation, just listen. Okay? That's what the person needs. The person does not need an apology. What the person needs who's been harmed is they need to know that the person who hurt them knows how much that person hurt them. They need to know that. Okay? So that doesn't mean that means that the person who caused the harm isn't doing anything other than listening. Okay? So when I prepare people, I don't care what the age is, when I prepare them, I spend about half the time talking about listening. You're going to be called upon to listen, and it's going to be difficult at times. And you're going to bite your tongue, and you're going to sit there, and you're going to be respectful, and you're not going to say a word. Okay? And honestly, I get a little bit tough sometimes, because that is in fact what is necessary. Okay? I did one a week ago. 2 weeks ago when I was coming back from Egypt, I stopped in Portland, Maine, and it was a year ago. A year ago this month, 8th grade middle school, Cape Elizabeth, which is the elite city in Maine, just south of Portland. And a boy takes a sweatshirt. Apparently this is the thing that was going around on TikTok. Takes a sweatshirt, sort of rolls it up like a towel, puts it behind a person and pulls it. Okay, he does this. He's a young boy of color in a school, in a class where he is the only boy of color. It's his first year there, and he gives in to the pressure to do this thing. Okay, so he does this. She hits her head. She's unconscious. Has to go to the emergency room, and a year later is still suffering from the after effects of the concussion. Oh, sorry. She's an all-state field hockey, right? She's all-state field hockey, choir. She misses can't even go to her graduation. Okay. All the boy knows that he did was that she had to go see the nurse. She had no idea what the year was like for this young woman. Okay. And I said, you're going to hear some things that you do not know happened, but that you caused them. And I'm not going to tell you because you're going to hear those things. Okay. And you just need to listen and listen with respect. And she's a shy girl. She's Native American. He's African American. She's Native American. What's amazing is, and what is amazing as an aside, what comes out oftentimes in dialogues is commonalities. They're both young people of color in a school almost predominantly white. Okay. She's shy at first and sort of slow, and so our job, as Melinda and you other facilities, is just slowly help them tell their story, not to suggest what their story be at all, but in a sense to give them permission to tell their story, right? You know, I think we're all, I mean, I know this, I'm an introvert, particularly if you're an introvert. I mean, if somebody asks you, how was your day? Number one, they don't really want to know how your day was, right? And if you tell them anything, you give them the cliff notes, right? You never tell them the whole story. You know, in our society, we don't get to tell our whole story very often, right? You know, there's incredible power in telling the whole story, okay? So this young girl, she told her parents the story. She told her doctors the story. She told the police the story a long time before. But she was used to do it in sort of, in fact, there's sort of like this groove. This is the story. This is what happened, blah, 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 blah. You know, but as she started to tell her story, there was no response. And so she had the courage to tell a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. She ended up talking nonstop for 40 minutes, okay? The boy breaks down in tears. Why? Because he had no idea what the harm was, okay? And that's so often the case. I mean, you think about any crime that happens, most of them, I mean, the crime takes place in a minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, boom, gone. That's all the person knows that they did. Okay, unless they read a police report because their lawyer reading the police report. So now here they are, and they're hearing the whole story. And so to watch this young woman, it's almost like she grew up in those 40 minutes. She's growing up. She's gaining confidence and courage to talk and to look at this young person. And then finally, even before he said anything, to forgive him. She wanted nothing to do with him, thought he should rot in hell. And at the end of her telling her story, without him saying anything, she forgave him in a very meaningful way, and he's crying. And then there's so much more. I mean, the backstories on any one of these, they're incredible. But so it's about storytelling, okay? It really is about storytelling. So one way I think about restorative justice, and I don't want to go too late, is you can look at it on the micro level or the macro level. Okay, so the macro level is the storytelling level, okay? Which is those of us who are practitioners, that's why it's so meaningful to us to be witness to these stories, okay? So what about on the macro level in terms of changing the system? Can you change the system, by doing this kind of work? So my last 5 years as a prosecutor, 2005, 2010, I ran the Juvenile Bureau. We had 13 full-time juvenile prosecutors, and I knew nothing about the juvenile law. I never even read the juvenile code, but I did know something about restorative justice, and I was determined to apply the flame of restorative justice to the juvenile system. Okay. So I remember when I took over, had a meeting with the prosecutors. We did a day-long retreat, and I told them, I said, listen, I know you've heard things about me. I said, I'm not going to make your lives difficult. I said, you're not going to get nearly as many cases as you've been getting. Don't worry about it. None of your business. It's not your business what you don't get. You only worry about what you get. So let's say a year from now, you're getting about 50% of the cases that you've been getting the last 5, 10 years. You better be doing a better job on them, because the cases you get are the cases that you need to get, the cases you need to spend time on. And I tell you this little piece because that's what prosecutors need to know. Okay? If you are able to successfully get them to use restorative justice, refer, whatever terms we use, you have them hopefully see that they will have fewer cases, and fewer cases means better quality, okay? Because we do need people in the system, okay, in front of the judge, because maybe you can't access treatment without a court filing, which is oftentimes the case in the juvenile world. Many services can't be accessed without a formal filing. We call it a delinquency petition in Iowa. But many things don't need a delinquency petition. And so what I started doing was I would get cases from the juvenile court people. Was that Department of Corrections here, or what do you call them here? Is your juvenile and adult systems, are they together?
No,
They're separate? Separate. Okay. And I was saying, the court, the Supreme Court, and the DOCs under together. So, what was I going to say about that?
fewer
There's the other
cases.
thing I told,
Fewer cases.
I told Kathy, I said, Kathy, I'm almost 72. I said, when I was here 8 years ago, I had more, and arguably more brain cells. It's okay.
You got the files.
So I would have my secretary send letters to the young people. We've sent 3 letters, young people, their attorneys, and the public defender's office. Said, listen, received a case in which it's alleged that you committed a burglary or a motor vehicle theft or whatever. I would say I've reviewed the reports, I find merit, but I want to give you an opportunity to have for there to be a resolution that's not going to cause you harm or something like that. And I said, if you want to meet with this, it'll be a week from Tuesday, 4 o'clock, juvenile court office. So the system we set up there was, and when we're talking about the macro level of restorative justice, we got to be talking about systems. Okay, systems within systems. Okay, there's the overall system that we're dealing with, but then you create little systems within the bigger system. And so the system we set up was, we would, every Tuesday afternoon, and sometimes it'd have to be another afternoon too, we would have restorative meetings. Okay, it'd be the young person, mom, dad, both, grandma, minister, lawyer, prosecutor, juvenile court officer, and we would have a conversation about, in Iowa law, in the juvenile law, it says that you're to do what's in the best interest of the child. That's the standard, right? Best interest of the child. We don't have that at the adult level, sadly, but on the juvenile, that's what's in the best interest of the child. And i.e., what does the child need? Okay, the law says what's in the best interest. Restorative justice is what you need. And so we'd have a conversation around, not how do we punish you, but what do you need? You know, what are the needs that are not being met, that if they were met, you wouldn't be likely to do this? And we would reach a restorative consensus if we could reach one. And if we could reach one that didn't involve filing, okay, filing delinquency petition, putting a kid in court, then that's what we would do. We'd have an informal, it's called informal adjustment. And so in about 1 year, we cut court filings by 50%, just by actually asking restorative questions. What do you need? Okay. What do you need? How do we get there? Okay. And can we get those needs met without a judge telling you you've got to do that? Can we get those needs met by you being supervised and having appropriate responses to what you did? Okay. And those might be meeting the person you hurt in a dialogue. Okay. So I learned, I didn't know before then, if you're looking at restorative justice, if you're looking at wrongdoing through a restorative lens and also a macro lens, that you can in fact impact the system. So for 5 years, almost 5 years, court filings, they dropped down to that 50% of what they used to be and stayed there for 5 years. Okay. Same thing happened, by the way, if you got any social workers here. Same thing happened on the social service side, on removals and what do you call them? Child need assistance cases. Child welfare. On the child welfare side, we cut those in half by 50% by saying, no, we're going to have conversations. And we'll put plans in place. And we're not going to file every time you want a filing so that a judge will yell at a parent. We're not going to file just because of that, okay, because you can't get your job done. You know, we're going to file only when the needs can't be met by not filing. Okay. So yes, so I became convinced that systemically that restorative justice can have an impact. Now, for me anyway, the word's still out a little bit. I wanted to address it real quick because I see I have, I'm going to give you one example. Welfare fraud. It's a little bit like a circle. How many of you have been in a peacemaking circle? A lot of people. And you know that you feel comfortable, right? You know, you feel comfortable. Kay Pranis, who I'm sure Belinda knows, many of you know Kay Pranis. I asked Kay Pranis, who's sort of the peacemaking circle guru, I asked her years ago, why do you do circles? Why don't you do dialogue work? And she said, well, Fred, why don't you do circles? And I said, well, I like the intensity of dialogues. Oh, well, I do circles because that's how I want to be with people. And once I took her training about 15 years ago, oh, I get it, Kay. Yeah, that's how I want to be with people too. Yeah, and so you feel comfortable, right, to tell your story in a circle, even if there hasn't been a harm or anything like that. You know. So I grew up on welfare. Okay, no dad in the picture. The system took me and my siblings all the way when I was 12. Never reunited us. So I pretty skeptical of the system as a young person. Okay, so that shaped my way of looking at the world. So one of the things that I had to do, I'll give you a little side story. So as my mom, 20 years later, she runs the office that takes people away. Okay.
Oh.
She went back, got a college degree, and now runs that agency. Okay. And I'll never forget, she died in 2006. I was going through a small box of belongings. There was a letter from, and I'm tying it into what Joe said. There's a letter in that box from her boss that said, well, it was an assessment letter. She says, you know, if you can tolerate somebody breaking the rules all the time, then Mary's the person you want as the boss. Okay? Because she was always breaking the rules when it came to poor people, moms, you know, all that stuff. And she left one book for me in that box. It's an incredible book of poems. Roger Housden was the editor. It's called Risking Everything. If you were going to have one book of poetry that's an anthology, Risking Everything. It's incredible. So thank you, Joe, being the good homilist that he is, brought out some memories that I had forgotten about. So yeah, the risk is the big thing. You got to risk. So anyway, so one of the things I had to oversee, I'm bringing this up because of the community piece. This is before I realized how important community is when it comes to restorative justice. Mid-90s or so, I hated prosecuting welfare fraud cases. Okay, but they kept coming from the state. So I called up the guy at the state. I said, listen, I will not take any more welfare fraud cases from you in your office unless they're at least felony level. You can never send me fewer than 20 at a time. And you have to know that they're all going to be reduced to misdemeanors. Oh, okay. So I get the first batch of 20. I have my secretary send a letter to all these moms. They're all moms, right? We've received an allegation from the state of Iowa that you defrauded the government in the amount of $3,222. We've reviewed the reports and find merit in them, but we want to give you the opportunity to have a different outcome. And if you want to come to a meeting at the county attorney's office a week from Tuesday, there'll be an attorney there to answer your questions, and we will lay out how you can get this taken care of. We got like a 98% response without fail. And the deal was they'd come down on the Tuesday and say, you got to do 2 things in order to not have a felony, okay? And then ultimately to have your record wiped totally clean if misdemeanor. You've got to go to a church a week from Monday and take a class, okay? And the class is going to be on life skills. And so we found really good people in the community to teach about balancing your checkbook, about domestic abuse, about landlord-tenant law, about just different things, okay? So they were community members. But what was really cool was there was one church that hosted it, but 5 churches that participated. And we did these once a month, 20 to 25 women every month, once a month. And the other churches would rotate and come in and fix the meal and sit with the women, okay, during the meal and engage with them and have conversations, you know. And you have to imagine that when they would come in the morning, they would be suspicious. By the end of the day, they were friends, they were hugging each other, exchanging information about each other. And the judge, Judge McInerney, dear Irish judge, he would come at the end of the day and take their guilty pleas. They never had to go to the courthouse. He would come, we'd have a written guilty plea to a non-felony, they'd work out some nominal payment plan, and they'd go on an informal probation, no probation fee, and the case, not only would they get a simple misdemeanor, they get a misdemeanor instead of a felony, but they'd get what's called a deferred judgment, and it's gone. So that was my first, I think as I look back, that was my first inkling about how important the community is in this stuff. Now, the community wasn't doing the dialogue work or the circle work, but they were coming and saying, you're part of our community. Okay, we're going to break bread with you. We're not just going to fix meals, serve you, and go back and talk amongst ourselves. We're going to sit with you, you know. And I don't know, I just love that program. And we've done other things like that too. And the reason that those things come about is because of restorative justice makes you look at things different. You know, am I going to keep doing this? I didn't want to do it anyway at all, prosecute welfare fraud moms, but we're going to do it this way? Isn't there a restorative way to do it? Restorative meaning they feel like they're human beings instead of criminals. That's what's restorative in that context, right? Is having them feel like they're worth something, you know? And just that one thing, just an 8-hour class in the basement of a church and a good home-cooked meal, you know, and they would leave. And the recidivism rate, there's virtually no recidivism on those people. We track that, okay, virtually none. We did the same thing. It really bothered me. The judges would send people who couldn't speak English, Spanish being their primary language, to an English-speaking class. What is that about? So I went to a rich guy, got him to give $10,000. We went to a Catholic church that had a large Latino population. We did the same thing. We created the Latino Community Orientation Program. People in the community were bilingual, and they would spend the day with each other. And the idea was we welcome you into our community, but we want you to know things because we want you to be successful. And unless we give you some information on landlord-tenant law and this, and we had a really good Latino police officer come. He'd spend an hour on what do you do when you get stopped by a cop? How do you handle yourself? Okay, so restorative justice. We could say, I mean, at the core, it's the meeting, it's the conversation, but it really can permeate, right? You know, and really cause us to look at things beyond the one thing. Okay, the one thing's still the most important thing, but can cause us to look at, and then we can start to see, okay, how do we create these little systems? It's not a matter of changing the overall system all in one swoop. Never going to happen. It's never going to happen. It's like you do it in this sort of, I don't know if this is the right word, insidious way, and we do it sort of like secretly. You know, we do it with the welfare program and the Latino Community Orientation Program. You know, we do it with these things, so before you know it, most of what we do is restorative justice, you know. And but you have to be sort of sly, you too. You do. You have to be sly like a fox, right? In some of this work, you know, because you can't tell them your whole agenda, you know. So there are those. So then I retired in 2010 and started applying restorative justice processes to workplace conflict and church conflict. And it's incredible because those places people get hurt all the time, right? That's what church conflict's about. People get hurt. They weren't seen. They were dismissed. You know, same thing in the workplace. You know, you said this to me 5 years ago. Well, no, you said it 4 years ago. You know, you know. But we don't use a mediation model. We use a restorative justice model. We just don't use the language. Okay, but we use the process, recognizing that what's at the root of this conflict is hurt. Somebody actually hurt. They're hurting. And if you brush over the hurt, it does you no good to get to an agreement. You know, so you have to, what I call, peel back the onion. Go back and back and back to the furthest thing back that anybody can remember about why we're here today, you know. And it takes a long time, 2-3 hours sometimes, you know. And churches are even worse. They're incredibly, you learn a lot from church conflict. But in church conflict, we use motivational interviewing, we use dialogues, we use circles, we use the whole toolbox, in a sense, when we use restorative justice in a church conflict. Let's see. So I better move forward to something somebody wanted me to talk about, which are community surrogates, okay? So, about 10 years ago, I started going to Maine, and we started the Portland Center for Restorative Justice. About 5 years ago, the elected district attorney in Portland asked me if I would enter into a contract with him and his office to implement restorative justice in the office, okay? About a year into it, that contract, COVID hit. 4 years ago, right? 4 years ago. And he said, Fred, court system's getting backed up. We're going to be in a heck of a mess. He said, I've got cases I can never get rid of. I've got some cases I'm just going to get rid of. I can't tell anybody. I'm just going to sign off dismissals. But then I got some other cases where I need to get something out of it. Is there something in what you do, you know, in that restorative justice something? Could we use that? And I said, well, yeah. I said, but it'd have to be by Zoom. I said, I do some Zoom work, not a lot, but some Zoom work. He said, well, a lot of these, I'm okay with Zoom. He said, a lot of these would be the person who committed an offense, and there wouldn't be a victim. Either the victim doesn't want to participate, or there wouldn't be a victim, like, let's say drunk driving with no accident, okay? Or drug possession, or operating on a suspended license, or shoplift from Kmart or Walmart, I always appreciated that he didn't think of shoplifting from Walmart as a victim. And I said, I'll tell you what, okay. So I was president of the board, and I said, I bet most of my board members would volunteer to be, this word came up, community surrogates, that they would represent the interest of the community, because restorative justice speaks to that, right? It speaks to the interest of the person who caused the harm, the victim who's harmed, but also the larger community, right? And the larger community is affected. I mean, if any of you think, if you've ever had a burglary on your block and it wasn't your house, but now you feel less safe, right? Mm-hmm. So we're all affected by wrongdoing, even if it's not directly inflicted on us. So it's very appropriate to involve the community in conversations. So we just started doing those. I would facilitate them. I have a couple other people facilitate with me now on those, but we did it by Zoom. I recruited my board members, and now we've got, I don't know how many, we've got many more community surrogates now. Okay, I do a little training for them. I do an informational thing by Zoom, and then if they're interested, I do a Zoom training. And then if they still want to do it, then they're a surrogate. They're in the dialogue. And I did not think, this I guess I'm very excited about, because I did not think that they would be meaningful for me. Okay. I knew they were going to help the system by getting rid of some cases, but I didn't think they'd be meaningful. I mean, when you facilitate burglaries, robberies, homicides, that kind of thing, and now we got somebody from the community talking to somebody about shoplifting from Walmart, but it didn't take long to see what a unique process this thing is, okay? Because there's no victim there, and so it's the volunteer, the facilitator, and the person who caused the harm, and I never start talking about the harm at all at the beginning. It's introductions, this is confidential, make sure they understand confidentiality. And I always tell them, listen, I get paid by the government, but I don't work for them. I have a contract, I have no obligation to tell them anything about what you say. In fact, I cannot tell them anything. And then sometimes I say, I am not an agent of the state. And that usually relaxes them. And then we talk a little bit about restorative justice, and I said, restorative justice is about repair, okay? Repairing a wrongdoing. And in this context, you just talking about it, that's part of the repair. But then I'll say, listen, those of us who do this work all around the world now, we do not label people. In restorative justice, you do not label a person. They're not a criminal. They're not this criminal. They're not this criminal number. You're not a defendant. You're not a burglar. You're John who made a mistake, okay? And what's much more important than the mistake you made is who you are as a human being. So we spend time just talking about who they are. Where were they? Are you a Mainer? Were you born in Maine? Grew up, school, family? What do you like to do? What have been your challenges? And however long it takes, we have a conversation about who they are as a human being. And then, so what happened last October? What was going on that day? Not even why did you drive drunk? What was going on that day? Okay, well, my girlfriend broke up with me, or I lost my job. Because there's always a backstory. And they don't give you the backstory to make excuses. They hardly ever make an excuse or minimize, but there's always a logic to it, sort of, And so then we explore that, okay? And then, what was it like to get stopped by the police? What were you thinking? And what actually happened? Did you get taken downtown? What was it like to be booked? So then we explore all the consequences that occurred as a result of making that poor decision. Okay? And then, what do you learn from that? What insight do you have? What have you put in place so that it's not likely to happen again? And that whole conversation takes rarely an hour. I mean, 1 out of 20 take an hour. 40, 45 minutes max is the usual, okay? But they're so interesting. They're interesting for the surrogate. I consider it. I think say it here. It's actually, I think of it as sort of a radicalization, experimental radicalization, because you get all these people who don't, they're progressive, but they don't know anybody who's committed a crime, let alone know the kind of lives that they have to live, okay? And so they get their eyes opened. And I've seen the level of compassion move up incrementally with these volunteers. It's just quite amazing, And at the same time, many of them are aghast at, you mean that's against the law? Or, that happens? They had to do that. They had to do 4 things just because they did this. So it's a really interesting. I would encourage you to explore it because it's really good for the offenders and the person who caused the harm. I don't like the word offender. And at the end of the time, my agenda, if I have an agenda at all, when I do these, is that at the end they feel like they were respected. They were treated with respect. And you can imagine, okay, what seed is planted when 2 people meet with me? I've done something the law said is a crime, and yet I'm not made to feel like a criminal. And not only am I not made to feel like a criminal, I'm encouraged, and I don't know, out of every 4 or 5, they say, well, can we do this again? Well, sorry, we're not therapists. Because they're so unaccustomed, right? So unaccustomed. And if you're doing jail work, prison work, you know all about this. But they're so unaccustomed to being treated with respect, And as a restorative justice practitioner, I've trained maybe 8 people in Des Moines now who have already been doing restorative justice work for a long time. But they really like this. It's like a break. It's a little furlough from restorative justice work because it's not so difficult to manage. Like if you have a victim, you just have the offender. You have the offender and somebody from the community, And so the management of it as a facilitator is just much, much easier, And but you can use, in addition, you can use the surrogates, as some of you may know, for much more serious cases. It's been a couple of months now, but I had 10 young offenders all moved to adult court on forcible felonies. Each one but one, they were looking at 25 years in prison. Okay, but they went into what I call the Youthful Offender Program. It was a program I started in the early 90s for kids moved to adult court on prison offenses who could earn a non-felony. And so I've been, me and some others have been facilitating restorative dialogues with young people in that program, very serious offenses, not by Zoom, in person, with somebody from the community. And most of them have been, I've got 4 or 5 black ministers who are wonderful, and they love being community surrogates. And we don't even sit at a table. We sit in a small, comfortable room, couches, easy chairs, have something to drink, low light, and we just talk for 2 hours, And they're all skeptical at the beginning, right? And at the end, and some of them have, as a result, started going to a men's group meeting. One's in a barber internship program. Another one's working with a carpenter because of a connection that was made. So this idea of having community members, that's what we're here to talk about somewhat, there's a lot of room for it, a lot of possibilities, maybe as a facilitator, but also as being this community representative, whether it's a Zoom dialogue with a person who caused the harm, or whether it's in person with somebody in a much more serious offense. But and again, these young men, not used to being in conversation, right? Just not used to being in conversation. And in none of the conversations, I facilitated 10 of those, none of them were told, you need to do this or this. You need to straighten up. You need to fix this. None of that. It's just, what's life like? What's it been like for you? What are the challenges? What makes you feel good? Well, I like to sketch tennis shoes. Fantastic. Can you sketch one for us? And So the idea of using the community, not using, inviting the community into the system by having community members engage in these kinds of conversations, I think has a lot of possibility. So in Maine, I've been doing it going on 5 years now. We've maybe done 5 years. When I started doing my contract with Polk County in September with the county attorney there, we've maybe done 150 in 6 months. Got 30 surrogates, 30 volunteers, 7 or 8 facilitators, and yeah. One other thing, sort of tangential to this conversation of being surrogates is while restorative justice isn't one thing, it may not even look the same necessarily from one office to the next. Okay, so in Portland, Cumberland County is the largest county. We're in the process of creating a nonprofit specifically to carry out the restorative justice mission of the district attorney. So to have a house to receive all referrals. Okay. Now, we backed off on that a little bit to have it be, at least for the first year, only the ones involving community surrogates, okay, would be referred to there, because that district attorney wants me to still be the one who does the in-house serious ones, you know. But just the idea of having, and she recognizes, you know, I may lose the next election if I put something out there in the community, and she can't legally control it in any way whatsoever, but if something gets created out in the community that supports the restorative justice work we're already doing in the prosecutor's office, even if I get beat, it's going to be tough to dismantle it because it's out in the community. Okay. See, that was a mistake I made in my first 20 years, is everything was in-house. We never created something outside the community to house this. Okay. Same thing in Polk County now. There's an existing entity, much like Belinda's. It's called Iowa Mediation Services, and they've been around since the 80s. They're who I trained with in the 80s. And beginning July 1, they will manage all of the referrals on Zoom cases with the community surrogates, the facilitators, pay them stipends. And circling back around to how does this impact the system? In Polk County, the county attorney, by the way, this is sort of an interesting thing, both of my bosses, so to speak, both women, both 58, both ran on restorative justice platforms 2.5 years ago. Both beat people that people thought could not be beat. But they got beat because of the restorative justice message. Okay, so pretty cool. Okay. In Polk County, there's an existing nonprofit that is trusted. So they're gonna recruit and train surrogates and set up the sessions that come from the point person in the district attorney's office. So both offices have a full-time county attorney, district attorney, staff person who is the point person for all these referrals. Okay, and both of them are very, very good. They're very knowledgeable. They know how to talk to offenders. They know how to talk to victims. And so that's a piece of it too. Obviously, who's the person in the office or the people in the office? They got to be on board. You don't have to have the whole office on board by any means, but you got to have the critical person on board. You know, I remember. It's the big city. I'm terrible at cities. Where's DeVos from?
Grand Rapids.
Grand Rapids. I did a training in Grand Rapids, and then about a year later, I talked to the woman with the center up there, and I said, how many cases have you got since I was last here? Well, we've got 20. And I said, oh, okay. And how many have come to the table? How many have you actually done? 1. Oh. Well, tell me about the person in the DA's office. Well, she doesn't really buy into it. Of course. You get 5% because the person on that end who's making the call doesn't buy into it. You know. So there's there's that hurdle, right? So you have these hurdles, but, so I think it's past 7:30. So any questions, any thoughts? And what do you, tell me what absolutely makes no sense?
You might be able to see that this microphone's on a cord. So if you want to ask a question, come over to the side of the room and I'll hold the microphone for you.
I can't just be really loud. So,
Ask Craig if the camera can hear you.
okay, just a quick question. When you get the group of young men, those juvenile serious offenders together, are they in a group in that process with the community surrogates, or is it one by
It's
one?
one-on-one. It's one-on-one.
Okay,
And that's by design.
great. I just wanted
Because
to make sure.
of who they are, the seriousness, it deserves a one-on-one conversation.
Okay.
We do use circles now in juvenile court. I did a 2-day peacemaking circle training in February, and now juvenile court services is allowing those people I've trained to do a circle every Thursday afternoon with anywhere from 8 to 10 juveniles. So those circles, but they're less serious offenses. They're not juveniles in adult court looking at 25 years in prison. So, and that's another thing, that's for another conversation. When do you use dialogue, when do you use circle? Yeah.
I just wanted to ask about the community aspect of kind of the Des Moines area.
Yeah.
So I'm from Kansas City, Missouri
Okay.
originally, and then went to undergrad in Maryville, Missouri. So not terribly far from Des Moines.
Not very far.
I know Des Moines is more progressive than most of Iowa in general, or Missouri.
Yeah, for sure, in Iowa.
Yeah, and it sounds like, so you spoke a little bit about the major stakeholders and the investment that is necessary in that aspect of things, right, in the prosecutor's office, things like that. But more of the community aspect, how did you garner that support from the community to really allow the program there to flourish?
That's a great question. I did actually have a card on that. So,
Microphone.
try to give you this in 60 seconds. And somebody was talking about advocacy. Maybe it was Joe earlier. So when I retired and was doing workplace conflict work, I was also doing graduate work at Eastern Mennonite with Howard Zare on conflict transformation. And we had to, the only requirement was we had to write a blog once a week. And so, blog, Howard liked my blogs. He said, we worked out a side deal that if I did 150 blogs, I get 3-hour credit, totally separate. But anyway, I wrote one blog. He said, you got to get this published. And it was about a case I had early in my career that some of you, I may have told you about it, where 2 neo-Nazis did damage to a synagogue, okay? And it was the first, it was maybe 93, 94, it was the first case in which the public, whatever the public is, the public became aware of this thing called restorative justice. Because there's this incredible thing. We met for 4 hours in the synagogue one evening. There were 2 Holocaust survivors, the rabbi, retired member of the Israeli Secret Service, a couple other people. And we sat around a table and we talked about what had happened and the impact that it had. And they learned about the boys, the boy and the girl. And I said something about atonement because it was the first time I actually connected atonement with restorative justice. Near the end, it had been incredible. And they were sort of brought back into the community, this couple. But near the end, the rabbi asked the boy, what do you want from us? And, well, we want to be forgiven. Okay. Well, it doesn't work that way in our tradition. We have this thing called atonement. And just the forgiveness part is part of it, but you have to do something. Okay. So then that led to this incredible conversation of what would atonement look like, okay? And it was decided that they each would do 200 hours. 100 hours each, working with the custodian who had to clean up the mess over a several-week period, and the other 100 hours with the rabbi over the course of the summer studying Jewish and Holocaust history. Okay, and then we agreed to come back in 6 months. Came back in 6 months. They'd done everything. They'd done absolutely everything they had to do. The rabbi spoke. He was teary. These are my friends now. Okay. He went to court, advocated for the cases to be dismissed. The couple got married. They invited the synagogue to come. Some people from the synagogue went, took presents, you know. And that was probably the first serious case of notoriety, 94, in which we used restorative justice. And that convinced me, oh, you can do restorative justice on this. Because quite frankly, there was a lynch mob mentality in Des Moines for the month leading up to their arrest. Everybody, we're going to get these people, we're going to hold them accountable, they're going to do time, you know, it's just, and these were churches coming together. We're going to support this synagogue by doing the worst we can to whoever did it.
Right.
You know?
Crucify him.
Yeah, crucify. You know, and then out of it came this beautiful story, you know. One of the Holocaust survivors talked about being in a concentration camp and watching his parents murdered, you know, and I'll never forget it. So I wrote that story for the Des Moines Register. They put it on the front page on a Sunday. And then a community action group got a hold of me called Amos. And I think you have the Industrial Areas Foundation up here somewhere, right? IAF.
We have a variety, one in Ypsilanti, and one in Detroit, one in Grand Rapids.
Okay. So they wanted me to come to a meeting, and out of that came, we created a justice research committee, and I served. So I got a quick education community and community work like that. And out of that, some of it was a lot of pretty tough letters to the editor about what the county attorney done. Because after I retired, juvenile court filings went up to 167%. So they skyrocketed after I retired, after going way down. And this appalled people, as it should. So they're writing up. But then the community came together, and Amos is an IAF affiliate. And at the time, it was about 30 churches, maybe it's 45 churches now. So we created a court watch program, which we talked about last time I was here. We created a school mediation program, which they called the Let's Talk program. And that program, in and of itself, has now become its own nonprofit. It's called Let's Talk Now, the nonprofit. They're in many, many schools, but all trained about a decade or so ago. And then we did a racial profiling program, created one in conjunction with the law school, you know. So I met a lot of really good people through that time. And so when I came back to Des Moines, was given the contract, I reached out to them first to see, would you be interested in being a surrogate? And I would say maybe of 40, 30 of them are from Amos, part of community organizing in one fashion or another with that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's I mean, you go to who your friends are, you know, and now I get people calling me, I've heard about such and such, you know, I'd really like to do that, you know, whatever it is, you know, and so, I mean, my goal, our goal in both counties is to have a couple hundred surrogates, you know, representing the community, you know, and it's not burdensome. You can do it once a week, you can do it once a month, you know. I have a retired minister, Joe, by the way, who probably does 3 or 4 a week. He just loves it. I have a PhD therapist who says, I'd much rather do this than see my clients. I've retired school teachers, nurses, retired a woman who used to be director of the Iowa Department of Public Health. And now we're at the point, which is really cool, we've been doing it long enough, particularly in Maine, where we know where we know what people are good at. Okay, so I have a good friend, he's alcoholic, recovery 30 years, great in the AA community. And I oftentimes use him for young men in drunk drivings. Okay. I have another guy, retired emergency room physician. He's great on drunk driving cases because he's seen it all. Okay. I have some nurses who are really good with young moms. Okay, struggling to raise a family, so they're shoplifting, you know. So it's really cool, that part. It's just, I really enjoy the recruiting part. And then over a period of time, seeing, you know, who's good at what kind of conversations, you know. Yeah.
Another question?
Yeah, Brad, I was wondering if you could address a little bit about juvenile gang members and how that program would work when they're going to be going back to their community afterwards.
Well, that's a really tough one. And gangs aren't much of a problem in Maine. They are there somewhat. They're a considerable problem in Des Moines because we're close to Chicago and Kansas City, and in Minneapolis as well, and we're right on the interstate. So gangs, a lot of homicides that come out of gang stuff. Of the 10 I told you about that I did in the last couple of months with young men going to prison if they failed, all gang members, okay. And is there an easy solution? No, they all have to go back, right? They all go back. They either go to jail, prison, or they go back to their community. So it's really a conversation by conversation, you know. There's not a systemic response to gang that I'm aware of. You know, I know there's some really good people doing work. The priest in Los Angeles for years is wonderful. And there's really good people that do that work. I certainly don't have a solution to it. I do know by making a connection over a 2-hour period with a minister or a teacher or somebody who really cares about them can make a difference. You know, they exchange phone numbers, you know. They're invited to come to a church men's club. They're invited to go to this or that. I don't know. I don't have an answer for the gang problem other than try to have these. I mean, my mantra is you change the world one conversation at a time, okay? And who knows where a 2-hour conversation is going to go with an adult who really cares about this young person he or she just met, you know? And isn't there to tell them how to run their life or fix their life or anything, just there to hear their story and comment on their story, and yeah.
Hi, Fred. It's great to hear you and your experience. I have 2 questions. One has to do with power differentials in when there's harm created. I'm thinking specifically of situations like domestic violence. And could you talk a little bit about the extent to which you've had that experience? And also, I worked in a prison for a couple of years.
Yeah.
And there were some people who didn't care what they did.
Right.
And has that come up where, you know, I mean, you have great stories about people who had the feelings for the harm they caused. And I remember one person just dismissing the murder he committed because the person had no worth.
Yeah. No, I get that. I would say, actually, I would frequently get that in the early years from other prosecutors who would say, you know, he's a psychopath, he's a sociopath. There's absolutely no way he's only going to cause harm. Okay. And I would say, well, it's the process that brings about change. It's not that person before they're ever in the process saying, I'll participate in the process, because they don't have a clue, you know. So, are there people? Yes, we screen people out, no doubt about it. There are some people that, at least where they are in their life, emotionally, spiritually, whatever, they just cannot, they can't do it, okay. But I think that's a pretty small fraction. I really do. At least in my experience. I mean, maybe 30 years, maybe 15, 20 times I've said, no, we cannot let that person meet the person who was hurt. You know, that's out of many, many hundreds. Because it's the process, it's the meeting, it's the hearing the story, you know, and the person who murdered somebody doesn't care. I don't know. I have to know the facts, first of all. But, yeah, I mean, we've done homicide cases, and they're as powerful as you get, you know.
And domestic violence?
Domestic violence. One thing I got to address before we did domestic violence, and that is it's my opinion anyway, providing a safe place for the victim to tell his or her story, even if the response is inadequate in some way, does not mean it wasn't worthwhile. Okay? I think that's a misconception, that somehow it has not been successful if the offender hasn't come out better. Because the need is on the part of the person who got hurt. Okay, it's the person who got hurt who needs to tell their story. And if that story brings about a change in the person who caused the harm, fantastic. And usually that is the case, but it's not always the case. I had one, that was about a year ago. It was the president of the school board, okay, very progressive school board in Maine, near Portland, bringing in fantastic curriculum around race. This a wacko for about a year and a half, stalked her, okay. Went to school board meetings, came right up to the line in terms of doing something illegal, text, social media, all kinds of stuff. Okay, bad guy. What happened was, on a Sunday evening, he sends a text saying, if your father doesn't, if you don't resign by 5 o'clock tomorrow, I'm going to tell the whole world about your father. She knew nothing about what that was. But the threat was, I'm going to tell the whole world about your father. Well, in Maine, there's a law that if you make a threat to a public official as it relates to their official duties, that's a crime. So they finally had a crime to arrest him on. Okay. I met with him and his lawyer twice, each time for about an hour and a half. He clearly had significant problems. It wasn't a matter of intelligence. It was a matter of born without a heart. I don't know. I really don't know. It's one of the, I mean, I wasn't scared like he was going to murder me, but it was scary to be in the presence of somebody who didn't appear to have a heart, you know. So I told the woman that. I said, listen, you can meet him either in person or by Zoom, your choice. I don't want to be in the same room with him, but I want to meet him by Zoom. And I said, you can tell him whatever you want. You bring whatever notes you want. I assure you, he will not interrupt you. Okay. Now, I cannot say how he's going to respond. He may have no response. I may be surprised, whatever. She came with her husband. We did by Zoom. Her husband, her mom, and one of her daughters. For an hour, she read from a legal pad. Because of all the terrible things he'd done. You know, kids were taunted. Okay. Afraid to go to school because there were kids of parents like that at the school, you know. And all kinds of things. Her husband was going to murder him if he could find out where he lived. Thank God. Didn't, you know. But she went an hour telling her story and the story of her family. Okay. He just could not respond in a way that by any appearance looked like he was moved. You know? So is that a failure? Because he wasn't moved by her story? No, it's not a failure, because she got to tell her story to the person who heard her, you know. And she said that later on, you know. No, it didn't feel good. Didn't feel good the way he was. But I feel so much better because I can tell my story. So, yes, there are people that can't be moved. There's no doubt about it. And there are people that should be in prison. No doubt about it. But I think they're fewer in number than we think. Okay.
Just one more. I promise I don't think I talked as long. But I did just have one question. My name is Amber, by the way. I do work for the DCR as the Family and Restorative Approaches Case Coordinator. And I did just have one question, just in regards to like the community service and or volunteers. Just in regards to how is there a way that you can explain like the restorative justice process to them, or so they're not afraid of like the content of like the things that are like happening in the cases, because I do know that sometimes they are egregious and it's a lot, and I know it is a lot and it can be a lot, and sometimes it's too much for some people. But like, how are you able to get like the community more engaged and active with like the restorative justice process?
Yeah, good question. Well, there's two. The DA in Portland, on the Zoom cases with facilitator, community member, offender, she calls that RJ light. and I think that's right. That's like when we were talking about under the umbrella of RJ, there's all kinds of places you can land. These are like RJ light. You know, drunk driving, shoplift, very minor damage, other motor vehicle infractions, stuff with cops sometimes, that kind of thing. So I've yet to have a surrogate be afraid of anything they've ever heard, you know. When I train them, and there's not a whole lot of training, I say, you just come as yourself because you're from the community, you know. You don't have a role to play like your facilitator or you're a counselor or anything. You're just you. You know, you're a mom, you're a teacher, you know, you're one of 8 kids, you know. Maybe you had a drunk driving once, or maybe somebody else did, or whatever. It's really a conversation that comes from your heart. Don't worry, there's no preparation whatsoever. Absolutely no preparation, okay? I never tell them, the most I will ever tell them is, hey, I got a 36-year-old man who picked up a first offense drunk driving. That's it. That's all they know, because I don't want them to be biased in any way. They know they're meeting somebody that committed some kind of an offense, so to tell them they got a drunk driving, you know. But I tell them nothing about it, you know, so that they have a blank slate, you know, when the conversation starts. Okay, and they listen and they respond, and some are more likely to share a personal anecdote than others. It's just up to you, you know, how much you want to share about yourself. Okay. When we start out, as I said, you know, I as a facilitator, I'll share a little bit about myself, not very much. The surrogate shares who they are, you know, why they do that. I always ask them, why do you take time? You know, Mary, why do you take time out of your day to volunteer to meet Jim? You know, you don't know Jim, don't know anything about him, and yet you've taken time out of your day to do this. And I said, well, you know, this restorative justice thing makes sense to me, you know, and I like to learn about people, you know, and people have different reasons for doing it, but I've never seen any fear whatsoever of anybody, either before or during or after, you know. Yeah, it's just it's such a human thing. It's just a very human thing. That's all, you know. And so I try not to overcomplicate it, you know. Yeah. Thank you.
I'll be the closer for tonight. So first, Fred, thank you deeply from the bottom of our hearts for your travel here. He actually just got here a few hours ago, so he flew in today, and he'll be with us for the next couple of days. During his visit here, he'll have a chance to have some roundtable discussion with our legal stakeholders. He's meeting with folks from the prosecutor's office tomorrow, and then on Thursday, he'll meet with folks who do defense work. We need to, as he's talked about tonight, we're looking at things on a macro as well as on a micro level. And on that macro level, we need to know that we need to increase our understanding for our stakeholders, make sure that they feel educated and empowered. And like Joe said in his opening remarks, be willing to stand on the front line with us and take these risks. So he will spend some time with them. So thank you, Fred, for your time. I know you've been traveling a lot, and I appreciate you fitting us in. And I want to thank all of you for coming and hearing us. If you have questions after you percolate on this tonight, feel free to contact the Dispute Resolution Center, thedisputeresolutioncenter.org. There's a contact button there. You can send your questions. And this is probably the same for Forge, friends of restorativejustice.org. You can contact either organization with your question, your comment, any concerns, any new thoughts that you have. Be a part of this dialogue so that we can push this forward. And it's so important that your voices are here. The last thing I want to say is that We are doing things here in Washtenaw County. The program has gotten started. I do agree with Fred. It's not a program for me. It's our way of life. But for the system stakeholders, it's a program. It's a transaction of some kind, right?
Yes, it is.
So we have gotten started here in Washtenaw County. We're happy that we've gotten started, but we need your advocacy for this. We need to keep pushing the envelope together. This is an election cycle. Talk to the candidates, understand what their agendas are. Talk to those who are not running for office. We have a couple judge seats that will be on the ballot, and the sheriff. That's a big race, the sheriff's race. So talk to these candidates about their agendas and hold them accountable for the things that they say. From experience, many people run on the platform of restorative justice. We have to be crafty with our questions to make sure they can actually do it. Not just talk about it, they can actually do it. So please be cognizant and aware of that. But reach out if you have questions, comments, concerns. If you want us to come to your organization and continue the conversation, we are available. So thank you.
Belinda, can I follow up on one thing Belinda said?
Okay, let me just also say one thing for you to think about. If any of you are connected with organizations where you're trying to do restorative justice work, over the next 3 days, we have a couple of events that might be relevant. So
200 North Main.
yeah, so just approach Belinda, one of the folks from the Dispute Resolution Center, and they can explain to you which event might be appropriate for you to come to.
I was just going to say, following up on what Belinda said, if you've taken Kate Prentice's circle training, or perhaps Belinda's, one thing many circle trainers do is they show you this medicine wheel. And it's a pie with 4 pieces, and it says, get acquainted, develop relationships, talk about the issue, theme, conflict, and then where do we go? So Kate Prentice, when I took her training in the early 2000s, the thing I remember most about is that circle. And she said, when you're doing circle work, do not skip over the getting acquainted, developing relationships, right? That's so important. And I found it over and over again, if you're doing this work, you know you can't get to trust until people got to know each other and develop relationships. You can't just jump into the conflict, right? So circle work has transformed my whole way of actually doing dialogue work. I spend much more time up front before I get into the messy stuff. So the reason I tell you that is, it was about 8 years ago, Portland Center for Restorative Justice, we're getting a few cases from juvenile courts, but not very many at all. So I'm flying out to Portland, and I got that circle thing in my head, and I got to meet with this guy, Mike Mack. He's in charge of juvenile court for the whole Southern District of Maine. And I said, okay, I'm going to use that circle. So I call him up, go to coffee. I didn't have to say a word about restorative justice. Just find out what's he interested in. He talks about his books. The next time, talks about his daughter. Third time, talk about his wife. Oh, we're getting pretty serious now. Finally, by I think the 4th or 5th coffee, well, tell me about this thing called restorative justice. Okay, so the whole transactional piece, that's what they're used to. People coming to them, people come and bitching about how they're doing their job and stuff, so they've got their armor up. But if you follow that and get acquainted and develop a relationship, and don't talk to them about what you want yet. Be patient. You talk about the 40-50-year thing. I was actually referring to a guy in Canada who in 1990 said, we're going to have a restorative justice system in 100 years. Okay. You can be patient. As it relates to in particular relationships, you may get further with this person than you do with this person. But, approach them restoratively too. Approach the systems people restoratively, right? Not just as people that are obstacles or don't get it or whatever, because they have their own issues, And, yeah.
Right.